Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, hosted by Eric Rostad. Join him on his 15-year journey through the immortal books. He'll share what he's learning, explore profound ideas across time and cultures, and share the one thing he always hopes to remember from each immortal book.
Happy New Year, everybody. On my desk next to me here, I have all the books that I read in 2025. And my plan for this episode is just to go through those books and talk about them at the individual level, but then also at the collective level. What are some of the themes, the ideas, the things that really stuck out to me in this reading year of 2025. If you're unfamiliar with the Books of Titans reading project, I am on a quest to read the greatest books ever written. I started in 2017 with a goal just to read 52 books per year. That was kind of a stretch goal for me. And what I would do is collect a big list of books and then decide on 52 of those. I'd randomize the order and then just start reading one at a time. Somewhere along the reading project, I began to realize a couple things. One is that I had limited time remaining for reading for the rest of my life. And then secondly, some books are more important than others. And so in 2023, I shifted the focus of this reading project towards the immortal books. Many people call them the great books. I like to call them the immortal books. And so what I did is I made a list of 200 of the greatest authors ever, and then made a list of the books of theirs that I wanted to read. And so I'm currently making my way through that list of immortal books in chronological order. So oldest to newest. And at first I thought it might take 10 years to get through this list of 200 authors. Once I got into it, I realized I need to extend that a bit. So I extended it to 15 years. And right now I'm actually considering a much longer time frame for the project, just to give me some options in terms of digging in deeper, following some rabbit trails. Maybe I come across something where I don't know what they're talking about, but that gives me the opportunity to read the book that they're referring to, that kind of thing. And so I'm actually considering a scope of 40 years for this reading project right now. 2026 will mark year 4 of the great books, or the immortal books portion of the project. So possibly 36 years remaining. I'm 45 years old, and so a 40-year time frame for the project would put me, in my lifespan. So I'll share a little bit more about that later, and kind of the thought process behind that. But that's where I'm at right now in this reading project. And what's really interesting is each year gets better. I think, oh, wow, the books I read this year, there's no way it could get better. And then the next year they get better. And then the next year they get better, especially as I'm going through these immortal books. So I'm really excited to talk about the books that I read this year and do kind of a recap of the entire reading year. My hope for you in this episode is that you get introduced to some books that you may want to read yourself. When I look back overall at 2025, there's kind of an overall theme, in just that I'm with the time period that I'm in right now of the immortal books. Most of the books are from Greece, and so I closed out reading the Greek tragedies this year. I read some of the Greek comedies. I read some of the Greek history, and then I shifted to Greek philosophy. So the first part of the year was where I was finishing the tragedies, starting the comedies, and then reading some of the history. And then in the fall is when I got into Plato. So I'll get into that a little bit more in the next segment. Overall reading stats, I read 38 books. I actually read more than that. There are some that I just kind of worked in for different reasons. But 38 are kind of the main ones that I'll be talking about today. And I read for a total, I'm a big nerd and I love tracking my reading. I read for a total of 347 hours during 2025. That's actually on the low end. 2024, I read for 408 hours, and there were other years that I read much more than that. But yeah, so 347 hours of reading. I get most of my reading done in the morning, so I try to wake up about an hour before my family. So, 365 days in the year, and I read for 347 hours. So I try to hit in roughly an hour a day. The longest book on my list this past year was the King James Version of the Bible. That took me 72 and a half hours to read. And then the shortest was The Frogs by Aristophanes. That's a comedy play, and that took me an hour and 46 minutes. So next, I'm going to talk about the individual books for 2025, and then in segment 3, I'll kind of take a step back and share some of my favorites, some of the ideas that tracked throughout the year, and that sort of thing. Well, I split each reading year into 5 different parts. I start off the year reading straight through the Bible, and I pick a different version each year, and then so I start January 1st in Genesis, and I try to finish by the end of February in the book of Revelation. Then I get into the Immortal books from March through June, and then in July I take a summer break of kind of more modern books. Then I go back to the Immortal books. I call that my fall semester, and that is from August through November. And then I take my winter break in December. So I mostly stuck to that schedule this year. I had a few slight alterations, and the main one being that I took the month of August to prepare for an event that we had with the bookstore with Alan Levi. He's the author of Theo of Golden, and so I read his book twice, Theo of Golden twice, and then I read his other book once. And I got to interview him for that event, and I did 2 different interviews, so different questions for each one. So I spent most of August preparing for that. Otherwise, I pretty much stuck to that schedule. So for the Bible this year, for 2025, I read the King James Version, and that was the first time I had ever read that version of the Bible. I loved it. I'll talk about it more in just a minute. And then in the Immortal books portion of the year from March, in my spring semester, from March to June, I finished up the Greek tragedies with Euripides. I started with the Greek comedies with Aristophanes, and then I read a few works of Greek history. I took a summer break, and then after August, for preparing for Alan Levi, back into the Immortal books, I started Greek philosophy, and I started with Plato. It took me a while to get into that, but once I did, I realized I was missing a lot of context. So I think I read 9 of his dialogues, of Plato's dialogues, and then I picked up some books about philosophy that preceded Plato, just because he was referencing these people, and I had no idea what they had said. So I got those books, and that kind of led to me rethinking the time frame for this reading project. So I'll talk about that when I get to that. And so I Plato, and then some of the pre-Socratics, and then in December had that winter break. So here are the books that I read during 2025. The King James Version of the Bible, the version that I read, was the one that is designed and illustrated by Barry Moser. Barry Moser is still living, and he did this just gorgeous version of the Bible. It's a huge book. I'm actually holding it right now, and it's very heavy. I would carry it around with me while I was reading in January and February, and I'd have to have a pretty big case to carry this around. But he has just a number of illustrations in the book, and I loved that. But it's just designed beautifully, and there's no verse markers. So there'll be a chapter marker, but not a verse marker. So it's very clean text. Beautiful. I loved the experience. And then with the King James Version of the Bible, it's 400 years old. And anytime that the Bible is referenced in most of literature, in English, it's going to be using the King James Version. So just having that in your knowledge base and knowing how it's referenced or how the language is in this version, it's very important for you as a reader to have this in your mind. And so I just even noticed other things where I might have a different version of the Bible in my head for a particular verse, but seeing it in the King James is like, oh yeah, this shows up here, or this shows up in this song, and I didn't realize this song was this exact part of the Bible but in the King James version. So I loved that experience. I would love to read the King James version again at some point. Right after that and I finished with a few days left in February. So I started reading a book about the King James Bible. So as I was reading it, I just kept thinking, how did this get translated? How, what's the process and all that? So I read this book called God's Secretaries, The Making of the King James Bible, in order to learn more about that Bible. And I really enjoyed that. I mean, it was an incredible book. I did a podcast episode on that, and I'll try to link to that in the show notes. But yeah, that was very interesting. So then when I got into March in the Immortal books, I realized that I had skipped over a particular author, and that author was Confucius. And what I had done is I'd been reading the Greek tragedies, and I decided to read all of the Greek tragedies. At first, I was just going to read a couple tragedies by each Greek playwright. And then once I got into them, I was like, these are so good, and they don't take that long to read. Why don't I just read all of them? So that's what I did. And, but then I realized, oh, wow, in the chronological order, I skipped over Confucius. So in March, I started off with Confucius, took a break from the Greek tragedies in order to finish or to read Confucius. And my thought process at the start there was, I think I can get through the Analects in 3 days. They're rather short, and that was what I had in my head. And so I started reading them, and I realized that there were certain words being used that I didn't know what was meant by that word. And so when I come across something like that, I think in my mind, I just think, okay, let me get another translation to see how someone else translated this word. And so I did that. And when I read the second version of the Analects, first off, I decided to just spend the whole month of March on Confucius, because when I started reading it, I realized, okay, I need to spend more than 3 days on this. And I'm really enjoying these, the Analects, the sayings of Confucius. And when I read the second translation, there was one part that really stuck out to me that really talked about remembering. And there's Confucius starts off this dialogue with one of his disciples, and he says something along the lines of, "Hey, do you just think I remember everything that I come across, whether it's reading or things I hear?" And the disciple says, "Yeah, isn't that the case? Don't you just remember everything you hear?" And he said, "No." Confucius says, "No, I tie them together into a single thread." And immediately when I read that, I knew what my single thread was. I knew the things that tied together the books that I read, and there is this kind of overarching thread that I have that does that. And the amazing thing about that is when I looked back at the books that I had read, it helped me to tie all them together and to remember them. And so that was a big epiphany for me this year, and it's something I've talked a lot about and thought a lot about. And but it really came about from reading that second translation of the Analects. After that, I read this book called The Authentic Confucius, and that was just I wanted to know more about Confucius. So I did all that during the month of March. Then I finished up with the Greek tragedies, and so I read Phoenician Women, Orestes, the Bacchae, and Iphigenia at Aulis. Those were the final tragedies by Euripides that I had not read. There's actually one tragedy that I left unread by Euripides, and the reason I did that is I don't want to go through the rest of my life having read all of the tragedies. I still want there to be some hope, some thing to look to, like, okay, there's still one tragedy. If I really need to read a tragedy, there's one remaining by Euripides. I'm actually hoping that we discover some other tragedies during my lifetime. There's hope for that as archaeologists uncover more and more. Hopefully we can find some of the tragedy plays that have been lost by Aeschylus, Sophocles, or Euripides. So in 2024 is when I read Aeschylus and Sophocles and most of Euripides. And so 2025 was when I closed out and read those final 4 plays by Euripides. I then read a few books that were for events that we were having at Landmark Booksellers. And so one was called Free Speech, and then the other, There's Nothing Like This. The There's Nothing Like This book was about Taylor Swift, but it was from a business point of view, and it was really interesting. And we had this author in, he works at the Harvard Business Review, and he looked at Taylor Swift's career, but but wrote about it almost like a business case study. And I studied business, so I'm familiar with the case study process. And so just looking at her career through that lens was really interesting. And then having this author in for an event and to hear about the book was really fun. And we're near Nashville here, so there were people at the event that have worked with Taylor Swift, and so just kind of hearing some of those stories was fun. I then went into there's a few other plays by Euripides: Suppliants, Ion, and Helen, and then the Bacchae, and so those were the ones that I closed with. In Bacchae, I read that for a second time, just because I was having trouble understanding that one. I also slipped in Philoctetes by Sophocles within there, and that was for a reading group that I was leading throughout the year. I'll talk about that right after I get through the rest of these books. After I read Euripides, I've closed out Euripides with Euripides Fragments, and those are 2 green Loeb books that go through the fragments that we have of Euripides plays. So these could be lost plays. Maybe we found a fragment of a play, and so it's highlighting those fragments. But more often, it's like maybe Aristotle is referencing a play by Euripides, and he'll quote a whole section, but we've lost the entire play, but we have this quote from Aristotle, and so we can read that and try to get a feel for what this play would have been like. I geek out on that stuff. I love reading these fragments, and so I read those by Euripides there. Then I got into Aristophanes, and Aristophanes is the Greek comedy writer, and so I read Clouds, Birds, Lysistrata, and Women of the Assembly, and those were all translated by Aaron Puchagian, and then I read The Frogs for a 5th comedy play. My plan was actually to read all of the comedies, and when I got into them, I couldn't do it. And I think part of the reason is just I was going from the tragedy plays and then into the comedies, and the tragedies are these there's lofty ideals. Yes, there's craziness going on. It just like the worst things that people can do to one another. But there's also these kind of lofty ideals of what things should be. And this comedies just take that and flip it on its head, and everything's about, it's like you're going to watch a college fraternity put on a play. And so it's just fart jokes and just nasty stuff. And I was like, what? I didn't like it. I wanted to like it, but I didn't like the comedy plays at first. So I decided to not read all of them, but just read 5. And I got to the 5th one, The Frogs, and I actually really enjoyed that one. And so I may go back and read the comedies again, or just kind of try to fit them in some of my break months. But my experience with the comedies was not great, but after I got into them, I started enjoying them more. I then read the Anabasis and then Cyropaedia, or The Education of Cyrus by Xenophon. And those are works of Greek history. And that's how I closed out my Immortal Books spring semester between March and June. I then got into my break month, so summer break, and that was in July. And in that month, I read The Library of Ancient Wisdom, and that gets into Ashurbanipal's library, and I loved that. I really enjoyed that book. Next up, I read The Idea Machine by a friend of mine, Joel J. Miller. You guys need to read that book. It's about the book, so it's like a history of books, and it was fascinating. I didn't know much of this history, but just how what we hold in our hands. I mean, the absolute privilege. It's like the perfect technology, and we get to hold these things in our hand, but you get to see how history led to the things that we hold in our hands now. But the other thing Joel did in that book is talk about how even organizing books, like even in the library of Ashurbanipal or in the library of Alexandria, like just how having these huge libraries requires a system of categorizing them. And then if somebody back in the day went to a library and was like, I have this question, can you give me an answer? The librarians or the people working there would then they knew the books to go to, and they would kind of assemble an answer. And that's very much like our modern AI prompts, in the sense of we give a prompt in AI, and then it searches the databases, and it comes back with an answer. So he just kind of traces that, like the organization of a library has led directly to the AI that we have now. And so it's just very interesting. We had an event with Joel for that book, The Idea Machine, and it was awesome. I then read An Odyssey, A Father, a Son, and an Epic by Daniel Mendelsohn. And that we had Daniel Mendelsohn in for an event at the bookstore at Landmark Booksellers. And this book is it goes through the Odyssey by Homer, but through his story and his story with his relationship with his father. They took this cruise to kind of cover the areas from Homer's Odyssey, and I really enjoyed that book. I then read a few books, Bryce and the Lost Pearl, and then Tambika and the Shield of Wisdom. And those are by a buddy of mine, and we had 2 events with him at the bookstore this year. And those books are by Derek Holzer and Zach Fay. And so I read those. I just wanted to read them before we had the event at the bookstore. I then got into Theo of Golden and The Last Sweet Mile by Alan Levi. Again, that was to prepare for the event that we had with Alan on September 6th. Then I got back into my fall semester of reading, and that's where I started reading the Greek philosophy, and I started with Plato. And I read 9 different dialogues of his. What's funny is every time I get into a new genre, so when I went from the epic poetry into the Greek tragedies, it took me a while to get situated. I had to read Aeschylus 4 times each play. It just, I don't know, it takes my brain a little while to shift gears. I found the same thing happen when I shifted to Greek philosophy. Some of the first dialogues that I started with Plato, I had to read them 3 or 4 times just to kind of figure out what was happening. Even as I got into Plato, there were some that I just had to keep reading. One of those was Sophist, and I'm really glad I did. I learned a lot in that process. So I'm still in the midst of reading Plato. I then read a book by Robin Waterfield called Plato of Athens. So I wanted to learn about Plato. And so that was very helpful. But then just in reading Plato, he kept referencing these earlier philosophers, and they were the pre-Socratics and the Sophists. And I realized I didn't know what those people said or what they thought. And so I then purchased 3 books about early Greek philosophy. And I started reading those, and then my plan is to then get back into Plato. But once I hit November, then I got into winter break. So I'll get back into Greek philosophy in March of 2026. But purchasing those 3 books about early Greek philosophy really made me consider the project as a whole. And do I want to just read through these 200 authors relatively quickly? And I know 15 years doesn't sound like quickly, but it is if I'm just kind of reading through those and trying to make it through that list. But when I bought those 3 books of early Greek philosophy and thought, okay, if I'm reading Plato and I don't know what he's referring to, if I make this decision to read these 3 early Greek philosophy books, I'm going to want to do that for the rest of this project. Also, I decided this year in 2025 to read the complete works of Plato. That's not something I was planning on doing, but as I did with the Greek tragedies, I wasn't planning on reading all of those, but once I got into them, I did, and I loved it. And so I decided to do that same thing with Plato. I'll probably do that with Aristotle as well. So instead of just reading a few works by each author, I want to read their complete works. And then I want the freedom to read earlier works if I'm not understanding something. And so when I thought about that in this desire to read the complete works of authors, but then also to be able to stop and read previous works so I can better understand the author's works, I thought this is going to take a long time, but it's something that I want to do. And I don't mind the it taking this long. And so now I'm looking at the project as more of like a 40-year project, or something that takes me to the end of my life. And that actually really excites me, and it just kind of opens up more opportunities along the way of the reading year. In winter, my winter month, my winter break in December, I read these following books. The Rhetorica ad Herennium, and this is a book by Cicero, and it's actually, they don't think he wrote it, but they don't know who wrote it, so Cicero's name is in brackets. And I bought this book for just 15 pages that deal with memory and how to remember what you hear or what you read. And it's just something that I'm really interested in. So I read that. I covered it in a podcast episode, and I'm trying to incorporate some of those memory ideas. But it's really kind of the first work. It's from 98 BC, I believe, and it's one of the first works that we have that are still existing on the idea or on the area of memory. I read A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens for the reading group that I lead. And then I read a book called The Real Environmentalists by Jim Beach. Jim Beach was a teacher of mine in grad school. He taught entrepreneurship, and this is his latest book. Then I read The Secret Society of Success by Tim Scherr. Tim is a new friend here in the area, and when I found out he had written a book, I wanted to read it. After that, I read Living the Braveheart Life by Randall Wallace. I met Randall Wallace at a book event earlier this year, and so I wanted to read his book. Braveheart is my favorite movie, and so it was just kind of fun reading about both how much of the authors. So Randall Wallace wrote a novel called Braveheart, but then wrote the screenplay for the film. But to see how much of Randall Wallace's life shows up in Braveheart is really interesting. And then just to see how that movie came about, and the book and all that as well was great. After that, I read a book called Maria's Scarf. It's a memoir by a man named Zorro. And Zorro is the drummer for Lenny Kravitz. He's played with all sorts of musicians, and this was his life story. He grew up in poverty and just in an amazing story, an incredible story. I see Zorro quite often. We go to the same church, and so it was just fun to read his memoir. I started reading another book, When Bad Things Happen to Bad People, by a friend named Tim Story, but I didn't make it to the end of that, so that's going to have to go into a future reading list. Then throughout the year, I read the following books as part of a reading group that I lead here in town. And so we do one book a month, and it's called The Short Great Book. So I try to pick a book between 2 to 5 hours of reading time. And so here's what we did. And so there are 12 books here, and these are just one book per month. Started in January with Gilgamesh, then did Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. And what was incredible about that meeting is one of the descendants of Frederick Douglass came to the meeting. She was telling us stories. It was incredible. Agamemnon by Aeschylus was March. April was The Great Gatsby. May, Philoctetes by Sophocles, which is my favorite tragedy play. And in June, it was The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. July, The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. August, we covered Theo of Golden by Alan Levi. September, Poetics by Aristotle. October, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. November, White Nights by Dostoevsky, and then December was A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Then I also listened to 3 different books during the year. I try to avoid audiobooks just because I'm a terrible listener. I can't remember when I hear things, but there were 3 books that I decided to do an audiobook, and I actually kind of remember these because they're all about music. And with the first 2, they would play, or I would search the song that was being talked about and listen to it and then go back to the book. So the first audiobook I did was John and Paul, A Love Story in Songs by Ian Leslie. So that's about John and Paul of the Beatles. The second one was Surrender by Bono of U2. And then the third, Roots and Rhythm, A Life in Music by Charlie Peacock. awesome books. I loved all three of them. So glad I listened to those books this year. But those were the books that I read or listened to during 2025. In the next segment here, I just kind of want to talk just more in general about the reading year and some of the main things that stuck out. Well, if you've listened to other episodes of the podcast, you know that I like to cover a one thing for each book, kind of the main thing I always hope to remember from that book. And so I want to do that just for the reading year. What's the one thing that stuck out over 2025 in these books that I read? And it's a continuation of what my one thing was last year. And just that these immortal books, they're part of a great conversation. And so when I stated this last year, I talked about how ideas that Homer introduces, you see those ideas in the tragedies, and then as I'm now reading Greek philosophy, you're seeing these ideas taken further, and the philosophers are referring back to the tragedies are referring to Homer. There's this just neat conversation that's happening. What I didn't realize though, and what my one thing is for this year is just even with Plato, I don't know, I hadn't really read much Plato in my life, so I wasn't going off a lot of actual knowledge, but just kind of in my thought, I was thinking, okay, Plato's the first philosopher, so everything starts with Plato. But as I started reading Plato, he keeps referencing these earlier philosophers. And it just brought back that, yes, there's this great conversation happening. Plato didn't just invent these ideas, like he's referring to other people. And yes, he came up with a lot of great things, but there's this conversation that's happening from the beginning. And so I love seeing that. I love digging deeper into that. And that's my one thing for this year. My top 5 books for the year, I'll go from 5 down to 1. Number 5 would be The Idea Machine by Joel J. Miller. I just loved learning about books and the history of the books. I was fascinated by how much Christians had played a role in what we have now as the book, and just for different reasons of why they had to have it that way as opposed to having it in a scroll, and what that opened up in terms of seeing pages side by side and easily flipping to a part of a book, things that we take for granted now. Just a really interesting book. Number 4, The Frogs by Aristophanes. As I mentioned earlier, I was not really into the Greek comedies. I didn't like them all that much, but when I hit The Frogs, I enjoyed it. And what Aristophanes does in this one is he has Aeschylus battle Euripides in Hades as to who is the better playwright. And so having read those tragedy playwrights and then kind of seeing this comedy based on that, I really enjoyed that. Third, I just have to say Plato here, not necessarily a particular dialogue, but just I've been amazed at Plato. Just I can't wait to read the rest of his dialogues. I still have quite a few of them to go, and I'll kick back into those in March after I read the early Greek philosophers. Number 2, I would put Confucius, and mainly because of that epiphany I mentioned earlier, just on how he remembers what he reads. That has been such an important thing. I'm contemplating writing a book where that would be part of it, just on remembering what you read. But just that idea, and as I've talked to more people about it, and it's really helped them to remember what they read. Last up, so top 5 books. Number 1 would have to be the King James Version of the Bible. As I mentioned, I start each year reading the Bible. I love it. I love that practice. I love reading it kind of in a compact time frame. But the King James Version was just spectacular. And the language was beautiful. It helped me see connection points from other literature that references the King James Bible, and it was just a delight. Here are some categories. Greatest surprise would be Confucius. As I said, I thought it would take 3 days. I ended up spending the entire month of March with Confucius. Something that stuck out to me is just the audiobooks, where I do have trouble listening to books, but I found that if I listen to books about music and then kind of listen to the music in between, that really helps. The hardest book for me was Plato. The ones that I disliked the most would be some of the comedy plays by Aristophanes. And then just the best for the reading life would be that Idea Machine by Joel J. Miller. As for book, one thing I highlight each month in my newsletter is just my bookish life, just in working with a bookstore, but then just traveling to different bookstores, just in meeting different authors. These are some things that stuck out from 2025. That Short Great Books reading group that I led was a real delight. It helped me in understanding the books that I read for that. Just in the preparation, I love kind of getting a book discussion going, and thinking of questions that would spark debate. Some of the meetings we had this year, just the discussion was in such a different direction than what I thought it would be, and it was so interesting and good. If you have the opportunity to either lead or join a reading group in your area, please do so. You can do them on Zoom as well. I've done those in the past. I like those, but there is something very powerful about getting together with people in your community and reading books. So that was a highlight from this past year of 2025. It was I'd led a reading group about the Iliad the year before, but this was the first time I had done something over a whole year, and I really enjoyed it. Another big thing from 2025 was that Alan Levi event. Getting to interview him was so fun, and I loved that process of just reading a book and listening to other podcast episodes, making sure I wasn't asking the same questions, really trying to dig into areas that I was curious about or I thought hadn't been explored in other writing or other podcast episodes. So that was a true delight. In a really fun time. Some other events during the year with authors that were memorable were ones with Malcolm Guite, Daniel Mendelsohn, and then Randall Wallace. Also had just an incredible time visiting bookstores in both Scotland and England this year. There was one store in particular, Peter Harrington in London, where I got to go into a room where every book is over £5,000 cost-wise, and it was incredible. I mean, just first edition Moby Dick's, Christmas Carols, Tolkien, just incredible. I loved it. One other kind of big thing that happened this year, I liked to track just how many books that I had read, and you just kind of keep a running tab, and mostly just because I know that without this project, I would never have gotten anywhere near that number of books. So it's just kind of fun for me just to see how many books that I've read and that sort of thing. But this year, that became complicated because I started buying books to where I would just get the book for 10 pages, or I would just get it for the introduction, or it would help me understand something. And so I bought a lot of books this year that I might have only read a few pages in the book, but I only wanted to read those pages. And so I've kind of stopped counting books just because I'm using them more as reference tools now, and not necessarily reading entire books. The books I mentioned in this episode, I read those books for the most part, unless I mentioned where I didn't read the whole thing. But yeah, I've got like a bunch of books that I bought this year that were not on this list that I would just read a very small portion of it. In terms of overarching insights or ideas, I want to highlight three that really stuck out. And the first was that single thread idea that I mentioned from Confucius, just trying to remember things through this lens of things that or a single thread that sticks out uniquely to you. Like you and I could read the same books and have a completely different single thread. That idea has been intoxicating. I have shared it with others. It's helped them remember what they read, or even kind of discover something about themselves that they didn't know. And that has been incredible. One idea from Plato that is really, I've been thinking a lot about is this idea that forms cannot be false. So you may be familiar with Plato's Forms, where we have instances or particulars of beauty on earth, but he says there's a form of beauty in heaven, and so the particulars or what we perceive of beauty on earth is just kind of a reflection of this form that exists in heaven. But there's this dialogue, the sophist, that gets into. They're trying to define a sophist, and part of what the sophist does is lie. And so if can there be a form of a lie? And there can't, because it would just cause chaos. There can't be true forms and false forms. And you think of that in terms of good and evil as well. And I hear a lot of like evil doesn't exist. Evil it exists, but it's a diversion from the good. So the good is the form, or the good is the thing that exists. Evil is an alteration from that. And so that's a very similar idea there with forms, but just helpful in terms of a thinking or a model for thinking. The third overarching insight came about in that Short Great Books reading group, and it was discussing the last book of the year, A Christmas Carol. And it's something I'd never noticed either in the films or the story of A Christmas Carol by Dickens. And that is that Scrooge was ethical. Like you can't pinpoint something and like, oh, he was off morally here, or yeah, you can say that morally, but like ethically, if he had gone to college and taken ethics, like he would have passed the course. Like he was doing things ethically, but there's a difference between ethical and moral. And you really see that in this book, and you can be as ethical as possible and just fail at life and fail at, kindness, and there's a different level of things, and you really see that in that book. So those were three kind of overarching insights from the year. I like to just think back to what would I have done differently if I could do the year again, and really the only thing would just be to complete Aristophanes. So I may go back and do that and read all of the comedies. I ended up buying all of the books of Aristophanes so I could read all the comedies, but just didn't like the comedies at first and stopped reading them. But I kind of wish I had read all of them. So going into 2026 now, I am going to think of this project in a longer time frame, which will open up just opportunities to, if I don't understand something Plato is talking about, I want to be able to go back and read the book or read the philosopher that he is referring to. Same with Aristotle. So in 2026, I'm starting the year off again with the Bible. And so I started that today, January 1st. And I'll read that. I'm going to try to read the Apocrypha again this year as well. So I'll do that in January and February. And then in March through June, I'm going to get back into Greek philosophy. So I'll start with the early Greek philosophers and then try to finish Plato. My goal is to finish the rest of the Plato dialogues in that spring semester. In the fall semester, then I want to then get into Aristotle. And again, I want to try to read Aristotle's complete works. I won't be able to do that in fall semester, so that'll probably bleed into 2027. I'm going to also continue the reading group that I'm doing with the Short Great Books, but instead of also doing it online, I'm only doing it in person this year in Franklin, Tennessee. So if you live nearby, if you're in the Nashville area, I'd love for you to join. But that's really been a fun thing, and just feedback from attendees. It's something that's been really important in their lives. So that's been neat to see. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. Thank you for just kind of following the project, and it's a huge joy. It's something I love it so much, and to be able to share what I'm learning, for people to be interested in that is such a delight. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email me at eric@booksoftitans.com, or just comment on this episode in Substack. You can follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter. It's just @Books of Titans. And you can also go to the website for all the resources of how to read more books, how to create a reading list, all sorts of things like that. I will be back next week with another episode. Until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.